These are tomatillos, and these weird, beautiful little fruits make one of the most delicious salsas known to man, salsa verde. And I'm just gonna come out and say it. If you've never grown tomatillos, well, it's time to fix that, because these things are basically like an easier to grow tomato plant. You can start tomatillo seeds at the same time under the same conditions as tomato seeds, and you should bury their stems deeply, because like tomatoes, they produce adventitious roots, and you can even trellis them like tomatoes. That list of similarities goes on, but tomatillos are actually even more pest resistant. They're more drought resistant. They're more resistant to diseases. Pollinators like their flowers more than they like tomato flowers, and tomatillos even require less frequent feeding than tomato plants. Ours are in pretty bad soil and are getting too little sunlight, and they still give us more fruit than we can even handle. And this Toma Verde variety even starts yielding earlier than any of our tomatoes. But on the flip side of all those pros, there are a handful of tomatillo growing mistakes that are unintuitive and honestly just really easy to make that are going to result in either tiny harvest or no harvest at all. Let's avoid them. Mistake number one happens early on in the seedling life cycle stage, like this one that we planted this year in spring. See, tomatillos get what is called leaf edema very, very easily if you overwater them. Actually, even more easily than your tomatoes and your eggplants and your peppers and all those other good nightshades. Identifying leaf edema is pretty easy. It looks like these discolored bumps on the plant leaves, like some terrible disease, but it's not actually an infectious disease. It's a physiological issue caused by environmental stress, specifically overwatering and soggy roots. This article and these photos on the University of Utah Extension Office site do a good job of explaining and visualizing what's going on here. I'll link to the article in the description. Now that watering is the root cause of the leaf edema damage in the tomatillo plant, I found in our experience they're even more susceptible to it if they're getting stressed out already by too much light and too much heat. See, what happens is that young tomatillo plant grows just a little bit taller, just a little bit faster than its neighboring tomatoes and eggplants and peppers and all of those good ones. And so it ends up just a little bit too close to those seed starting lights that are optimized for the height of the tomatoes. And that stresses it out, gets too much water, it's a little more susceptible to that leaf edema damage, and a little more susceptible to soggy roots, and you have a plant that is really stunted for life. This year, I ended up having to plant out 3 seedlings with leaf edema damage, and you can see these ones on the left are much smaller than these ones on the right that were in a different tray and didn't get leaf edema. That difference is even more noticeable if you look at these tiny stems on the stunted plants with leaf edema damage compared to the strong, thick stems of the healthy plants. All right, so what's our takeaway? Basically, don't overwater the tomatillo plant and don't let it get too close to those lights and let it get too stressed out by too much heat and too much light. Now, after overwatering, my second biggest piece of advice is going to be to stake your tomatillo seedlings early, like right after you get them into the ground. This year, we had a couple late spring windstorms, and in those storms, we lost 3 out of 5 of our tomatillo seedlings, despite the fact that we only lost 1 pepper and none of our tomatoes. Those tomatillo seedlings really don't stand up to the wind very well if they are not well supported. Tomatillos have a stiffer, thinner, more inflexible stem than a tomato. See what I mean here? This is a very woody, rigid stemmed plant with no bend. And unlike this flexible tomato stem that bends and gives in the wind, at least a little, tomatillos snap and they die. There is a reason that I have 2 very big, healthy tomatillo plants and 3 teeny tiny, very weak tomatillo plants. These 3 small ones were supposed to end up in the compost pile because they were so stunted following the leaf edema damage, but I ended up having to plant them out after we lost those 3 in that first big windstorm when I had forgotten or really just neglected to stake them early on. I'm sort of awkwardly using a modified Florida weave here out of convenience because they share a row with a tomato and it's working okay. We didn't lose any more plants after this went in, although I probably wouldn't call a Florida weave a perfect fit for these bigger, bushier plants. So I sort of hate saying this, but a tomato cage is honestly not a horrible option for these bushier types of tomatillo plants, even though I really do hate them for tomatoes. Tomatillos are considered highly self-incompatible, which means that the pollen from a given tomatillo plant, or from a given tomatillo flower rather, is not very good at pollinating itself and creating this beautiful little fruit. That's opposed to something like a tomato flower, where really all you need is a little shake on that flower to get the pollen to the right spot. The takeaway is you're not going to get a proper harvest with only 1 tomatillo plant unless you're super lucky and some nearby neighbors are growing tomatillos too. Some gardeners do report getting a harvest with just 1 plant, but most recommend at least 3, and there are plenty of sad tales of big, healthy tomatillo plants that never produce any fruit at all because they were planted all alone. Luckily, that does not mean that you actually need multiple varieties of tomatillo plants. These are all the exact same variety, the Toma Verde. It just means that you need plants with different genetics. So a propagated clone isn't going to do the trick, whereas plants from different seeds will work just fine. Before we get into the next tip, if you think this video might help you achieve your tomatillo dreams, please consider giving it a quick like. Super helps me out. Really appreciate it. Okay, let's get back to the tomatillo talk. Because tomatillos grow in this full husk or calyx, and they produce fruits that are not particularly uniform in size, it can be difficult to know when they're ready to harvest, and in turn, really easy to leave them on that vine for too long.
We definitely don't want to grab this little one here. It hasn't even filled out the husk yet, but it is important to pick them before they start to turn yellow and soften up like this one for a couple of reasons. First, the flavor and texture is just nicer if they're a little less ripe than this one.
The second reason is that tomatillos are kind of like cucumbers, in that if you get these really big kind of overripe fruit off the vine earlier, that's going to signal to the plant that it should focus on producing more new fruits and ripening the existing small ones. This year, we grew this Toma Verde variety of tomatillos, and we selected it because it is super early maturing, and I thought that might help us get a little bit of a harvest before the full heat of summer sets in and potentially damages our pollination rate. That turned out to be 100% true, but what I didn't know, or rather didn't even think to check, was on the growth habit of this particular variety. And that leads us into our fifth and final mistake to avoid when growing tomatillo plants.
The Toma Verde variety is more semi-determinate than true indeterminate, and our plants are a little bit more bushy than the more true indeterminate varieties that I was used to. I would have spaced them out and trellised them differently if I'd known that a few months ago when I planted the garden.
You know all these tomatillos that I've been looking at throughout the video? These are the extras that I literally could not fit in our pan when we made salsa verde yesterday, which was only a week after we made our last batch of salsa verde, which is currently sitting in the fridge because we have so much of it. Tomatillos are just such a cool, productive plant. As long as you avoid these 5 mistakes, you're gonna be eating your own delicious salsa in no time. And as always, y'all, happy gardening, and I will see you on the next one.